So where would you like to start tonight in this analysis of what's really going on?
Well, let me start, Alex, with kind of going back in time to let your audience know what has been the general way in which our foreign policy has operated since the turn of the 20th century. In other words, those that we call people related to an ideology of creating a world government or a new world order have used communism and crisis creation to break down the existing order, to create crises in order to have an excuse to come in and present an alternative which the public would not normally accept. But under a crisis, they will. I mean, we see this every day when the bailout, people are accepting unconstitutional powers given to the Federal Reserve, and they don't even question it because, you know, the economy is supposedly going to collapse if we don't bail out the big banks. The same thing happened with 9/11. They were able to justify many things that would never have been acceptable to the American people. And through the war on terror, you know, we've lost habeas corpus, we've got indefinite detention, all of these things. We've got unlimited surveillance of American people. All of this has come about because of crisis creation, created by the very people who are still in power and attempting to say that they have the right to create a solution. But those solutions will not lead to a true solution. Now, going back historically, one of the things that caught my interest when I was a college, when I was even in high school here in Oregon, was, and I had a lot of professors from Reed College who were on the left, and they were, you know, very friendly towards.
Oh, you're a Reedy.
They were very friendly, of course, towards you know, the far left and even communism. And in fact, there were many aspects of our own government in the beginnings of the 20th century where we actually assisted. A lot of people don't realize that it was Wall Street people that kept Lenin in his apartment in Europe waiting to take power into Russia. Through Frederick Engels, they kept Marx going to feed the ideological mill. In World War II was World War I was the first major turning point. Every major world war has been caused by reasons other than what is given in the history books. I mean, the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand was, of course, the trigger, but who created that scenario, and who was the one who gave the drumbeat to go to war just based upon the assassination? All of that was planned in advance. And the purpose, from the globalist point of view, of starting World War I was to make the first initial step through war to cause such a horrendous, catastrophe of human life and loss of human life. They would get the American and European people to sign on to a world committee of governments of people and that was the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations failed because of proper isolationist tendencies within the United States. They failed to go along with Wilson, who was controlled. Every president of the United States in the 20th century on has had a handler. Colonel Edwin Mandell House was his handler. He was a real globalist. And Wilson was a very manipulated person. At the end of his life, he said, I fear that this government is run by people far behind the scenes that have more power than I had ever realized. And he was sorry for the role that he had played in being manipulated. But they didn't get what they wanted in World War I. They didn't get the League of Nations. And what they did in the Treaty of Versailles is ensure that we'd have a Second World War by creating tremendous reparations against Germany that they could not pay without debasing their currency. In fact, we even had Wall Street people go over to Germany and teach them how to debase their currency as the way to pay off this debt.
The war was engineered for some people to make some money.
Not just to make money. We have to remember that from those that are against a New World Order from the standpoint of the left, everything is blamed on the evils of capitalism because the left generally distrusts capitalism. But capitalism isn't the target. It's what we call crony capitalism or mercantilism, whereas capitalists of a higher order with a lot of money get into bed with government and use the power of government to secure their position against competition in the free market. And that's not truly capitalism. That's crony capitalism, which is different. But they set the stage and created World War II by, first of all, financing Hitler. They financed the publication of his book. They set the stage by debasing the currency in order to, in Germany, create the conditions of despair that would allow both socialism under the National Socialist Party of Nazis and the communists to rise. And it was the juxtaposition, the contest of wills between these two socialist groups that Nazism was able to declare martial law and tyrannical powers because of what? The threat of communism. In other words, they always need a threat to justify tyrannical powers, and that's what Hitler did.
Interesting thing about that, you have the Reichstag fire, for example.
Agent provocateur turned out to be, they said he was a communist, but he was hired by the Nazis. Blamed it on the communists. Now, that wasn't to say that the communists were saints. They weren't at all. They would have done the same thing that Hitler done had they been in power. All right. But the real purpose of World War II was to provoke Hitler and to provide the arms, and most of the arms of Krupp Industries were financed by Wall Street. But it's interesting that Hitler, even though he was a dupe of many influences, had to be induced to attack England. A lot of people think that the bombing of London was something that happened because of Hitler himself, and it isn't true. He refused to bomb London. And it was Churchill himself that devised a plan with the other allies that said, now we're going to have to provoke Germany, and that's why they firebombed the Ruhr industry cities in Germany, killing a lot of civilians. It was only after that that Hitler authorized bombing London, because he viewed England as a potential ally in creating this great empire that he had visions of. A lot of people don't understand that in history. It was the United States and Britain that together decided to firebomb German cities. Totally unnecessary. They could have won the war without targeting civilian areas. In fact, there are pilots after the war that said, you know, we knew where the civilian areas were, that it was all, it still had lights on, and the industrial areas were all blacked out, and said, and when we got orders to dump our incendiary bombs, why did they load incendiary bombs? To create a firestorm. And he said, well, we got our orders, we knew they were going down on civilians, and we protested, but we were told to continue. So you see, there's two sides to these things. There is provocation. Of course, you must know, of course, about the six-point plan of Roosevelt to induce Japan to attack us. He actually went out of his way to cut off oil and to exacerbate the problems of Japan economically so that it would attack us. Not only did they know about the attack, they provoked the attack.
I've heard something about the code breakers were removed from their job, the ones that were looking for...
And the radar was shut down so that it could not see. All kinds of things happened to make it appear as if this were an accident, but it was not. This is detailed in Robert Stinnett's book, Day of Deceit on Pearl Harbor. Very, very carefully detailed. But what happened after the war was even more telling. We have George Marshall undercutting Chiang Kai-shek and pulling out military power so that Mao Zedong could come to power. The communists never would have come to power in China had it not been for the globalists. The Roosevelt administration was full of a lot of communists, including Alger Hiss, who was fingered by Whittaker Chamber, who was also a communist and said he was a member. But the establishment somehow always defended to the very death Alger Hiss. It is my opinion that Alger Hiss, in fact, was a globalist, that he went in, joined the Communist Party to help facilitate, because he was very high in the Roosevelt, to facilitate the other communists coming in to that. And we know that during the Roosevelt administration, Harry Dexter White and other communists, including Alger Hiss, helped facilitate much of the theft of critical technology materials that went to Russia in World War II. In Major Jordan's diary, he was the major in charge of the Lend-Lease base in Montana, the air base. He stopped the Russians from loading onto their airplane a lot of sealed cases that were sealed with diplomatic immunity. And they were acting very suspicious. He stopped, he opened the boxes, you know, which he wasn't supposed to, but he did anyway on a hunch, and he found they were full of the plans for the nuclear bombs. And he immediately confiscated the material. He called the White House for further instructions, and he was told, you are to close those boxes back up, give them to the Russians. He says, but they would contain nuclear plans. And he says, we don't care whether, you know, you are to give them to the Russians and not tell anyone about this. He later found out that they were also shipping the first nuclear material, enriched uranium, to Russia to facilitate their exploding the first bomb. So you see, here we have a future enemy that the U.S., in the name of Lend-Lease, is in fact giving our top-notch technology to. The same thing happened in Cuba. We undercut Batista militarily. The CIA, through Black Ops, got arms to Castro. We brought Castro to power. We had Herbert Matthews of the New York Times lauding Castro as a reformer. We had the second floor of the State Department full of a lot of leftists. But, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, the government was full of communists, and that's why this happened. But it isn't true, because when Earl Smith, the ambassador to Cuba, came raging back to the United States and complained to Eisenhower, who appointed him, about all of these leftists undercutting Batista and helping Castro, he said, well, go to the State Department and talk to them. And he found out that the higher-ups, who were not communists, were defending and would not remove any of these communists. In my opinion, this is evidence that we have higher-level globalists facilitating communists. And for what purpose? Because the globalists don't want to get caught themselves undermining governments. So what they use, they facilitate communist revolutions. We didn't lose Vietnam, except purposely. You know, we gave it away at the table. We'd actually caused them to come back capitulating at the Paris peace talks because of the bombing in North Vietnam. And then Kissinger simply gave it away to them. We lost Laos and Cambodia by forcing the pro-Western government into a coalition government with the communists. And you know what that leads to. We lost Iran. We lost, almost every country, without exception, that's been lost to communism was done by the facilitation of the State Department. And not because they were all communists. I believe that they had a globalist agenda of using communism to break down the existing order.
So it's maybe not accurate to say it's a communist conspiracy like others have said, but really a globalist one, as maybe we have been saying, that it's beyond capitalism, communism, and these different political structures that a lot of people have their eyes focused on.
There is a communist conspiracy. In other words, some people in the conservative movement have believed that our globalists control the communists and they're just taking orders from them. That isn't true. They are competing predators, competing for a new world order. And as we talked about, that's why Lula da Silva, who is a communist, acting the moderate role in Brazil, talking about our new world order, well, he's talking about on behalf of the Soviets. They want to control the new world order, and our Anglo-American establishment wants to. But essentially, the Anglo-American establishment is trying to use the communists to break down the social order. They can come back and rescue the countries, come in as the heroes, install, through manipulation of the press and the electoral process, a globalist, which is a more moderate form of socialism, one that doesn't believe in killing capitalism like communism does, but believes in milking capitalism. That is, let it have enough freedom. And that's, for example, the kind of free market capitalism that gave capitalism a bad name through President Bush. Bush is a globalist, or at least he's a puppet of a globalist. His version of capitalism, his version of free market was only for the big international corporations that were in bed with government. If you look at all of the NAFTA and WTO agreements, there's nothing in there that allows for freedom of the small guy, the small entrepreneur and capitalist. It's only for the major corporations. So there's a dual purpose. Once again, we promote globalism using the bait of free market to get people to accept it. But in essence, we're also defaming the free market, giving it a bad name through the horrible presidency of President Bush, so that it comes out as the enemy.
Very interesting. Well, I want to get your thoughts now on what's happening today, but before we do that, I want to get a brief description on Mao Zedong and supposed globalist support of him, and a little bit more about Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, which we alluded to earlier, but starting with Mao Zedong. I heard that he was supported by the Western bankers for a number of reasons. We'd like to talk about that.
Well, it's not so much you can say by the Western bankers, because it's only a certain clique of bankers. They're very much tied to the House of Morgan and J.P. Morgan originally.
House of Morgan,
that's
okay,
right.
That's specific. That's
and
one.
Lamont and several other Wall Street firms, and these were globalists. Mm-hmm. In other words, it isn't that bankers per se are evil. It isn't just that having money turns them all evil. There were people who were principled, who have money, and who